Okay, thank you all for coming. I'm John Dupré, as it says on the board, and I'm visiting here from the University of Exeter. So, let me start off with a very kind of general comment about the kind of thing that I'm doing. Actually, as a sort of background, a lot of the people I work with call themselves nowadays philosophers of science in practice, which sometimes means philosophers of science in practice and sometimes means philosophers of science in practice. But either way, people are supposed to be doing something relevant, connected to science. And I have to say, some of my colleagues sometimes will say, metaphysics, what's that? Why do we care about that? I thought we were supposed to be concerned with science and engage with science. Well, so I would just start off by saying that I think there are many reasons in my mind for being concerned with very general, very abstract accounts of what we're talking about or what indeed science is talking about. And so I'm interested as a philosopher of biology, which is my sort of primary job description, in giving or offering at least a very general account of living things. And I think that this is really important for biology, that this is, in my way of doing things, it's supposed to be what we sometimes call a naturalistic account. That's to say, a metaphysics grounded in the science, but also one that feeds back into the science. So we try and find out what the world looks like from the point of view of the best science we're currently doing. And then we might ask whether some bits of science need to pay more attention or perhaps are using a kind of an outdated or not very defensible view of their subject matter. And we could perhaps set them back onto the path of truth and goodness and beauty. And I guess another, apart from all that, as this quote from a much maligned 20th century philosopher of biology, Joseph Henry Wooger, says, you can't avoid it. You can't do science without a general picture of what you're talking about, and the general picture of what you're talking about is what I call metaphysics. Okay, so I think there is a constant interaction between metaphysics, ontology, what there is, what exists, and empirical science. Okay, so let me just start off with a very brief bit of history. The topic I'm talking about is a really ancient one that goes back to the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers at least. And here are two kind of archetypal figures from that period. Parmenides, who is famous for saying, change is an illusion. Everything is just what it is and stays that way. And we kind of, from our very limited perspective, see all kinds of things happening. But really, from a broader point of view, there is just the way things are. The complete opposite view, perhaps, was expressed famously by Heraclitus, the sort of patron saint of process philosophers, who said something like, nothing endures but change. There is only change. And this is, I guess you will realize, the view that I think, at least some version of which, I would like to commend to you. Now, of course, I'm just say change is an illusion is probably not a very fair, certainly for a philosopher of science in practice, is not a very fair characterization of the alternative to process metaphysics. So perhaps we should go rather to Democritus, who allegedly said, nothing exists except atoms and empty space. Everything else is opinion. So why is this? This is close to the Parmenidean view, because all there really is a lot of atoms. And the atoms are defined as being unchanging. Nothing happens to them. The only thing that changes is their relation to one another. That's to say, the atoms move around and then they come together and form you and me for a tiny instant in eternity. But they don't really change. All that changes is their relations to one another. Okay, so moving on a millennium and a half or so, we come to sort of dawn of Western science, and my basic message is Parmenides, or at least Democritus, won. And we have, and he sort of quotes from, I don't know why I got these separated, from Robert Boyle, one of the better known scientists of the scientific revolution. The naturalist, in explaining particular phenomena, considers only the size, shape, motion, or want of it, texture, and the resulting qualities and attributes of the small particles of matter. Basically, something very close to the Democritean view. They really are just atoms moving around. When we want to understand the things that seem to change, the sort of complex structures we encounter, we really just need to find out what the atoms are doing, how they stick together. Perhaps they nudge one another and things like that. But the things that we encounter at our kind of spatial and temporal scales are, in some sense, not really real. So what I want to say in this talk is that Parmenides' victory was a very disastrous one for the future study of biology, because it's much better to think of the living world in the Heraclitean view as composed of processes, change, as always dynamic, and in no way should we think in terms of the kind of Parmenidean, basically there's just atoms moving around in the void way of seeing things. Okay, so that's about it for history. So what am I going to do in this talk, moving into the future? So the talk is that all living beings are processes rather than substances. This is kind of rather technical term in the history of philosophy that I shall avoid on the whole, and I just tend to talk about things. Now, of course, there's no really good word that, that's why we have technical words like substance, but I'll say a bit what I mean by thing. So, I mean, don't just take it absolutely as any interpretation you might have of thing. And I shall use this to contrast with processes, and I'll explain this more. So I'll start off with saying something about this difference, and then I'll talk about why I think organisms, as one kind of paradigmatic example, should be thought of as processes and not as things. I should mention in passing, I just probably mention this again, I am actually very strongly drawn to the view that it's processes all the way down, that even down to subatomic physics, it's all processes. But I don't feel comfortable defending that view. I mean, it obviously would take one into some fairly technical bits of physics. I'm pretty comfortable down to the level of macromolecules. But if you want to go down to quarks and things, and and you have physics expertise as a physicist, which tells you that quarks really are atoms as Democritus might have thought of them. I won't argue with you, though I could if I really had to wheel up a few physicists, or at least philosophers of physics, who would disagree. But that's not my. So if you want to take this is really a talk arguing that living things are all living things. It's very hard to avoid the word, which tells you something. That living beings, living systems are processes and not things. And after talk about organisms, I'll talk more briefly about how we might incorporate some other levels of biological organization and form a general, might we say, metaphysics of life. And then at the end, I will just say a few things rather briefly about why this matters. Some of them I'll say a bit more about in further lectures this week. Okay, so first of all, things and processes. Okay, so what's a thing? So I think this is the philosophical orthodoxy that the world is made up of things. They are, and they're things specifically with properties we have, and that's, I say, is a kind of basis for a great deal of contemporary philosophy. The world, there are these things in the world, and they have various properties. Particularly, they have, and this is, of course, is another big area that I won't go into a great detail, but one kind of properties that's very important in this metaphysical tradition are essential properties, the properties that make the thing a particular thing, either a particular kind of thing or the very specific particular thing it is. And there are reasons why it's quite hard to make sense of a ontology of things without appealing to some kind of essential properties. But again, I'm happy to talk about this later, but I won't say much more about that now. Things are autonomous, and this I think is something that is really very important to the tradition of thinking about things. If you have a thing, it could be the only thing in the universe, right? I mean, it doesn't depend on anything else for its existence, or for its relations to anything else for its existence. Now, of course, there are maybe some things that contingently do for reasons of, for specific reasons, a thing of that kind wouldn't actually continue to exist if it wasn't related to something else. But in general, the interesting things, the most important things that we're going to talk about and assume in our philosophy of things are things that are autonomous in that sense. And finally, a thing has reasonably clear boundaries. Now, of course, as always, one can have a bit of fuzziness, but not too much fuzziness. I mean, we really ought to be able to see roughly where it begins and ends. And this is actually important for another reason, that a lot of the discussion of why we should think about things has to do with counting. We want to know how many things there are. And to be able to divide the world into a definite number of things requires that we know roughly where one ends and the next one begins. Okay, and I guess it's rather oddly arranged because I've gone back to essential properties. I'm sorry about that in the slide. I don't know quite what I was thinking. But when I say other properties, what I mean is non-essential properties can change. But crucially, when other properties of things change, we typically want an explanation, because the default for a thing is to stay the same. And I think this is a very important point for understanding what attracts the interest of scientists. They tend to be interested in why things change, giving explanations of change, typically by giving causes of change. Okay, so the default state of a thing is stasis. Now, I've got here are some examples of what we classically think of things. As I said, in my true view of the world, these are all probably processes too, but I'm not going to argue that today. So I'm going to take these very, a bit of furniture is very thing-like. It certainly has clear boundaries, doesn't seem to depend on anything else, and so on. Okay, so the question, of course, is whether maybe this is a thing. And I guess in traditional philosophical thought, this is a standard. Certainly if one used the technical word substance, this is a paradigm example of a substance. And I think it tends to be thought of in a thing-like way. So what about a process? For a process philosophy, being is dynamic. Everything is changing all the time. And what we thought of as things, certainly the biological things, are, as I like to say, and not the only process philosopher who has had this kind of paradigm for this, eddies. Things are eddies in a flux of process. We should think of the world as, at its most fundamental level, just stuff happening. But somehow, and that's the great challenge to understand the world, somehow out of this flux emerge structures that have more or less stability. Never complete stability, and the stability they have is maintained always by changes, by things happening. And my kind of definition here of a process is for it to continue to exist, for a process to carry on, it has to change. Things have to happen. So here's one of my favorite paradigms is I had actually, Jupiter was one of my examples of a thing. Here we have the red spot on Jupiter, which you might have thought was, you know, an island or some kind of, but actually what we know is that it is a storm, essentially. It's a storm maintained by winds, very high velocity winds. And the reason I like this example is ever since we've had telescopes big enough to see it, the red spot has been there on Jupiter. It changes its shape, but that's about 400 years, I think, that we've observed this entity, which, as I say, looks from a distance, it might be a thing, but is actually a process. If the wind stopped flowing around it, if the activity stopped, it would rapidly dissipate. And then here's some more typical kind of examples of processes. A river, which I guess was Heraclitus' most famous example. You probably all heard the saying from Heraclitus, which I won't try and discuss, though again, we could bring it up, that you can't step into the same river twice. He didn't actually quite say that, or nobody knows what he quite said, but he probably didn't, nobody actually thinks he quite said that, and so on. But that's what he's most famous for. And then, of course, finally, we move on to the most unthing-like processes. I have an example of a battle, which clearly, if everybody stops fighting, there's no more battle, right? So this is very clearly fits this definition. And again, of course, we can ask, you know, whether these paradigmatic organisms are processes, which of course is my thesis. Okay, so just to summarize, we have a conception of a thing as integrated. I didn't actually talk about that, but I guess that's almost implicit. It's always so obvious to say things, and perhaps follows from the boundaries. Independent, not dependent on for its existence on anything else, stable by default, and has definite boundaries. Now, none of these is necessary or even typical for processes. Processes persist through activity, i.e. they are not stable by default. And this is the strongest contrast I make where, as against things for which the default condition is stasis. And again, this is something I think has some real practical implications for how we should think about some scientific problems. So just a quote from one of the, well, actually two mentioned here of the most prominent contemporary defenders of process philosopher, Nicholas Rescher, and then in the Stanford Encyclopedia, his article was updated by Nicholas Rescher by Joanna Seibt. As process ontologists see it, enduring things are never more than patterns of stability in a sea of process. So that's really the thesis. And by process, I understand again something, and I often notice the embarrassment that in English one can't help saying something, anything, everything, all the time when one's trying to say there are no things. So please forgive this linguistic annoyance. Some entity, which just doesn't work in English, for which change or activity is necessary for it to continue to be the kind of entity it is. Okay, so one last sort of preliminary note. Many people will associate process philosophy with Alfred North Whitehead, who is certainly the most famous recent advocate of process philosophy. And I certainly don't want to demean the contributions of Whitehead, which were, you know, many, including this. But I really want to bypass Whitehead in my work for a couple of reasons. One is he is notoriously difficult to understand, possibly obscure. He also has some views tied in with his process philosophy that I don't want to endorse. I mean, I guess panpsychism, maybe sometimes I feel a little tiny pull in that direction, but it's fairly small. I'm not comfortable with it, certainly, or theology, which again, I suppose is quite widely associated with process theology, but with process philosophy, but not in my view of the world. And I guess finally, to be rather mean to Whitehead, I don't really think he's a process philosopher. And that's because I think he has an atomistic view of processes. And for any of you who are Whitehead aficionados, he has little things called occasions, actual occasions, things which look to me a bit like unchanging atoms which make up the processes. And I don't think we need or want such things. Anyhow, again, no disrespect to an important contributor, but I find it easier to reinvent wheels sometimes than try and figure out where the wheel is underneath all the mud in a in a very, overused kind of vehicle. This has gone much too far. Okay, right. So, organisms and why organisms are processes. So I think there are three reasons for thinking organisms are process, each of which is sufficient, and together we really, really shouldn't have any debate about this. So first of all, organisms, we all know, are dynamically stabilized. They are systems far from thermodynamic equilibrium, right? That's it's one of the puzzles for understanding life has always been how something so thermodynamically improbable stays around. And of course, we know the answer to this is through, in outline, there's a constant turnover of matter. Organisms take in matter and energy, and they process it, to maintain their structures and their functions. So it is the very nature of such a system, far from thermodynamic equilibrium, that it's doing stuff to maintain itself as what it is. Second, organisms have life cycles. They are not even apparently constant structures. In fact, they have a sequence of different stages, sometimes quite dramatically different from one another. And third, and this is, I think, is actually the thing that the aspect that really led me into process thinking, was realizing the omnipresence of symbiosis, and that actually organisms stabilize themselves not merely by what they do, their own taking in energy and processing it, but through their relations to many other organisms, cooperative relations, which I guess we know perhaps best through what we've all learned recently about our gut microbiomes, but of course we have lots of other organisms we're related to in many other different ways. And I'll say more about all of these. So let me just go through these quickly. Not much really to say more about this. Organisms are thermodynamically open systems, far from equilibrium. And this implies that they're not independent. They require constant input from the environment, sorry, typo there, nor stable by default, i.e., if an organism doesn't do anything, if nothing happens, there's trillions of things happening inside all of us at every second. If those stop happening, we become dead organisms. And if we stop taking in matter from the environment, we also more slowly become dead organisms. In fact, if you count oxygen, we quite quickly become dead organisms. So they're certainly not independent autonomous entities. Secondly, they are developmental processes. And I just give an example, which will all be quite familiar, possibly not the wonderful sea creature, I can't remember what that is, Medusa, on the bottom. There are some sea creatures just have wonderful life cycles. But my point is that properties change dramatically over the life cycle. We're all very used to the idea that the egg and the caterpillar and the pupa and the adult are the same organism. But if we were trying to understand how that could be the same thing, and there could be some essential property that said this is some same entity going through all these drastic changes, it's quite a struggle. I don't know if I might go to this later, but people sometimes think we maybe answered to that with the genome. Happy to talk about this. But just two things. Genomes are highly dynamic, of course, but also there are lots of genomes in an organism, and they're not all the same by any means, and for various reasons. I can certainly talk more about that if anybody would like to become a genome essentialist and defend that as a way of saying an organism is a thing, at least against this objection. So organisms don't persist by default, but as quite often happens for process, they persist, as always happens for organisms, they persist by some kind of causal continuity, but this is consistent with going through drastically different stages. And somebody in the seminar this morning brought up the example of a party as a process. Well, parties can be lively at one point, and then most people can leave and they can be really desultory and nobody's really saying anything. And nobody thinks the party is absolutely ended because it stops being lively or people stop dancing. We're very used to the idea that processes can go through changes. These are rather more dramatic changes, perhaps. I mean, from a pupa to an adult insect is about as dramatic a change as you could easily imagine, and yet we have no trouble in the idea that just the causal continuity of the process leads us to say that this is still the same organism. Finally, symbiosis. And I just got some, a few randomly selected illustrations here, but the basic point is that we now think pretty much all organisms. There are some sort of a few things floating around in the oceans that maybe don't have much to do with anything else, but on the whole, organisms are symbiotic. The famous one that everyone's heard of are humans, and there's a debate whether something between 50 and 90% of the cells in a human body are not what we used to call human cells. They're microbial cells. Trees have amazingly complex, or plants generally, relations to bacteria and fungi. There are these amazingly complex systems that interact with the roots. The fungi actually kind of live inside the roots and then through and out send their hyphae out into the surrounding soil, where they interact with consortia of bacteria, all processing the materials going in and out, and indeed, as now quite famously, passing material down the hyphal networks to other plants in their vicinity, sometimes plants of different species. So the degree of interconnectedness in complex botanical systems is stunning. And I guess, we often see the mushrooms that come out of these systems, but if we once thought that they were kind of independent, autonomous organisms, now realizing their very complex, intimate relations to the plants they live around, see something quite different. And I don't think I'll go into the insects. That's another nice system that's been much studied. So autonomous is not a word that really applies well to any organ, or any but a very small minority at any rate of organisms. Okay, and so I just, I like this a lot. So I just give one example, which leads to a thesis that I like to kind of use to illustrate the significance, one significance of this processual perspective. So here's one of the most successful organisms in a typical forest environment, leafcutter ants. I won't go too much into the biology, but you can see here's a picture of them carrying off little bits of leaf into their colonies, where they go various different castes. Some carry the leaves, some defend the colony, some look after the insides of the colony in various different ways. But more interestingly, inside the colonies, there are things that you can think of as the stomach of the whole system, where the leaves are processed by specialist fungi, actually by specialist fungi and that depend themselves on consortia of bacteria. There are different consortia in other parts of the system, and it turns out actually that I mentioned insects and some of their obligate symbionts. Wolbachia are a very well-known one. They actually also involved in these ants, and kind of rather interestingly, in some cases, the Wolbachia determine the sex of the ants. So if you were looking for some organisms that's running the system, since it's really quite important what the sex of the ants are and the caste of the ants, it may be the Wolbachia that are really running it as little reduced bacterial symbionts inside the ants. I don't think anybody has studied the role of viruses, but almost certainly viruses are involved. I think they're involved in pretty much any system. I'm not sure if I can mention that further today. And so what I want to say is there's lots of ways you could sort out an organism here. People will often say the colony is a superorganism. I mean, sort of technical term, but it's a very well integrated whole. The individual ants look most like organisms. But people often say, well, they're so far from autonomous. I mean, most of them are not sexual, so they can't reproduce themselves. But also, they can't. I mean, there's nothing they can do to survive on their own. You might think of the fungal stomach as an organism, that just a specialized organism for living inside ant colonies. Because I mean, it's nothing. It's not related by descent to the ants. It's a collaboration that's come together over time, and so on. So I mean, there are many ways you can carve, and of course, you know, there are questions at each point whether you include the obligate microbial symbionts as part of the organisms or not. There are many different ways you could carve up this flow of biological activity into organisms, which I call this thesis of promiscuous individualism. And I won't go into this now. Some of you may know I have a somewhat similar system view, which I call promiscuous realism, about kinds. But basically, this thesis is just organisms are abstracted from this flux for particular reasons, according to what you're interested in, why you're doing it. Okay, so processes, and I just want to say this is quite characteristic of a lot of processes. Processes intertwine with one another in quite complex ways and have quite indeterminate boundaries. This is quite natural for processes, very hard to understand things as entangled in this sort of way with one another. And I come back to the sort of example famous from Heraclitus of the river. And I think, you know, the way rivers keep constantly changing, merging, separating, is actually remarkably similar in some ways to the way organisms, particularly the evolutionary flow of organisms, but also just the flow of organisms in a complex system like the ant colony, can be thought of. Okay. So biology is all process, and another crucial thing to understand is that this process has multiple timescales. So evolution, I guess, being the slowest timescale, which we can think of in terms of, you know, many millions of years. Development, which can take from minutes to decades. And I guess something that maybe I should say, I hope it's sort of obvious, in a sense, it is the developmental system or cycle which is the entity that evolves. So you couldn't evolve just, you know, an ant caterpillar, a butterfly caterpillar. What has evolved is the system. The caterpillar can't exist except as part of this flow of process through the various stages. Metabolism at much faster rates is a great number of processes that keep the parts of the system running, keeping them in stable, in non-thermal, far from thermal equilibrium at many different rates. So all of the entities that one might think of in a hierarchy of biological systems are processes at these various time scales. And one of the really fascinating things in trying to get a big picture of biology is understanding how these timescales interact, how the processes at these different timescales build up or down to interconnect and maintain the stability of the whole flow. So what is an organism? Now, there's a horrible thing that I think I've never done before, which is that philosophers sometimes do, is when they want to break up words into bits, put little subscripts on them. So I apologize, but it just did seem it's a natural way of doing it. One of the so if you ask most biologists what they mean by an organism, they will say something like, I think, what I said by organism sub 1. So there are bacteria, which are single-celled organisms, and then there are multicellular organisms, which typically, or perhaps always, come about from a starting cell, which divides multiple times, differentiates, the cells differentiate, and we end up with a multicellular organism. Basically, all cells with roughly the same genetic constitution. I say roughly because that's problematic. But when we actually look at the systems that I've been looking at, we see that actually a real organism moving around contains cells from many different sources that combine to form a functional system, or the one that really interacts with the rest of the biological world. And so I'll call this an organism 2. And as I say, living systems typically involve a complexly intertwined interaction between many distinct organisms 1. And this, of course, is why defining the boundaries of organisms 2, which is, I think, is the most fundamental sense, is very difficult, underdetermined and interest relative, because there are different levels of interconnectedness between the various processes that interact. But it is these very roughly defined systems with somewhat indeterminate boundaries that are, I think, what we mean when we refer to organisms. When I point to a cow, I don't mean, as I say, that's a cow. I don't mean apart from all the bacteria in its 4 stomachs. I mean the whole thing that walks around and processes grass, right? So, and this is actually something that I formulate in a particular way as what an organism, or what indeed a biological system is the intersection between lineages and the metabolic intersection of various biological lineages. Produces these stable thing-like organisms, and the stabilization facilitates, of these processes in turn facilitate the persistence of the lineage. I haven't really talked about that. I'll get onto that a bit later. So here's the sort of picture. In the middle of the picture, we have a traditional kind of thing-like view of how I think it's still very common to think of the biological world as a hierarchy of things that are put together to form bigger things. So molecules making cells, cells making tissues, organs, so on. What I want to say is that these are actually all processes synchronized between different timescales, and crucially, processes that the synchronization is both from above and from below. So the traditional picture that I'm arguing against tends to be really bottom up. The molecules explain how the cells work, and then when you know how the cells work, you can put them together to form tissues and so on. But I just, looking right in the middle, I look at something like the heart. We all know actually that, of course, the heart has a physiology. It's made of certain kinds of cells that oscillate in certain kinds of ways. But we also know that if the organism doesn't take its proper exercise and eat its 5 portions of vegetables a day, that it won't function very well. So actually, the persistence of the organ depends entirely on its positioning within a more complex system that it's part of. And of course, we could also say, well, the organism would not, organisms would not persist if they were not part of lineages that keep throwing them out and so on. So all along, I think that we should look at not only the way the components at the lower level interact to get the behaviors of things at the higher level, but also the way the embedding in the higher level systems actually helps to explain the properties of the components themselves. Okay, so I guess what I want to say is that that's basically it. That's my summary of what the difference between a thing and a process is, and why organisms, and in fact everything along the hierarchy of biological complexity is really best seen as a process. I just want to now just say a few things about some implications that this has for what we should, how we should think about some quite significant problems. The first I want to say is medicine. It's, I think, extremely standard to think of medicine in relation to the organism as a mechanism that has, the set of parts that interact with one another to produce healthy existence, and something gets broken, right? We have to figure, so what we do is first of all figure out what the broken part is and figure out how we're going to fix it. And of course, sometimes that works very well. If you break your leg and you can't walk, we quite rightly think the best way forward is to try and get the leg to join together and restore its structural integrity, and then you could, with luck, walk again. So it's not that there's nothing right about this, it's just that it's, I think, a very limited perspective. Because I think from a process perspective, the central mission of medical research is rather to understand the processes that stabilize human life cycles at these various timescales and develop interventions that maintain, fortify, or of course sometimes restore these processes. I remember years and years ago, somebody told me, and I don't know whether it's true or not, and it didn't mean much apart from being memorable at the time, that in Chinese medicine, you pay your doctor as long as you don't get sick. If you get sick, then you stop paying your doctor. That came back to me. I just thought, that is quite wonderful. That is exactly how medicine should work. Of course, and I guess you contrast it with, the opposite paradigm, which I guess having lived in the US, American medicine is desperately trying to invent sicknesses so that you can pay somebody to say you don't have them anymore. That's a bit simplistic, I know. But it does seem to me that if you accept the view that the default of a process is actually ceasing to persist, I mean that processes persist by doing things, then you shouldn't have this, this is very different in its implications from the mechanistic view. And I think my favorite illustration, it sounds as if I love this stuff. I mean, I don't mean this in a, I like it kind of way, but I think the illness that makes this clearest to me is cancer. So let me just say a little bit about this. So when we think about human development, by which I don't just mean, like 0 to 15, I mean minus 3/4 to however long you live is a process of human development. And as we certainly know, this process involves this constant and massive division, differentiation, and disposal of cells, right? We, all through the life cycle, our cells dividing at various different rates, and at certain points differentiating so that we have different organs and so on. And there's also, we now know there are processes of times at which cells are disposed of. They've outlived their usefulness. Now, if you just try and imagine how exquisitely this process is timed to enable a human to go through a life cycle, if it goes wrong, if this doesn't happen right, a lot of the things that go wrong are things we call cancer, i.e. cells are not being disposed of as they should, or cells are dividing when they shouldn't, or cells are differentiating in ways that they're not supposed to. I don't know if you've ever seen some of these appalling cancers where you have little bits of organs in a tumor, a bit of, yes, one, yeah, quite once seen, never forgotten. But yeah, that sort of thing, feet and near here, and a bit of, yeah. But I mean, it's once I think you get your mind around the perfection of this process in a certain way. I mean, obviously, it's there's much more to be said about that too. It's the amazing thing is that most of the time we don't have, seriously harmful cancers. Of course, actually, we do have, incipient cancers all the time throughout our bodies, but most of the time we manage to suppress these and carry on through the normal life cycle. So cancer, we should assume, as we of course now know, is multi-causal. There is no, cause of cancer. There are countless things that make us more likely to experience cancers, and the way this is. So, like I say, the general problem is to explain why we often don't get cancer, rather than why we sometimes do, and how we maintain our developmental process on something. I put in quotes because normal is such a terrible word in biology, but on something that, let's say, a healthy path. And I think there are conclusions for this, that there is, I don't think we're going to find a cure for cancer. I mean, seems like this would just be extraordinarily improbable. It's as if somehow after evolution has spent all these billions of years refining this system, we're suddenly going to say something, okay, but it's a bit unreliable. Here's something that's going to make it 100% reliable. That's not going to happen. But there may be many cures for many cancers, which of course is rather the way we're going. And I think it at least provides a perspective that could help us think about this question in new ways. And I'm not a cancer scientist, so that I only throw that out as a general optimistic view. So here's another one that I've done a little bit more onto. Viruses. Now, viruses are, for me, a kind of paradigm process. If you hear people talking about viruses, I think they often imagine that there are these little things floating around the world that are viruses, and you run into one or two, or maybe a bunch of them, and then they do something horrible to you. Well, there's something true about that. There is a stage in the viral process, which is the very inert stage, the virion, which is a little thing that gets churned out by a virus reproducing in a host, and can start that process in some other organism. But actually, if you follow the life cycle of a virus, the virion ceases to exist for the active part of the viral life cycle, i.e. it goes into the cell, all kinds of biochemistry happen, the protein manufacturing mechanisms get co-opted, they make proteins for new viruses, and eventually the cell typically dissolves and a bunch of new virions comes out. So the virions then don't do anything until they hit another suitable cell that they can infect. So there is nothing that runs through the life cycle of a virus. Even actually, you might think that even the genomes don't always do this. They, for example, switch between DNA and RNA forms. Sometimes they sit inside the host genome for periods when, is that a virus if there's a little bit of the host genome doing nothing, that's just sitting there as DNA, which is waiting to turn into an RNA virus at some time in the, at any rate, it's extremely improbable to try and think of a thing undergoing changes. there's a thing-like entity that then initiates a very unthing-like process, at the end of which there's a bunch more thing-like entities. But the virus is surely the whole life cycle, not just the inert stage of its operation. So I think instead we should think rather of a flow of DNA passing through organisms, sometimes sticking. And actually, I think since I wrote this slide, unless there's another one coming, in which case I'm sorry if I'm anticipating. I don't think I. It turns out actually that some things that I didn't know make this perspective actually even more appealing, which is that it turns out actually that the infecting virus very often isn't a single virion. It's actually, people talk about viral clouds, quasi-species, and a lot of times it turns out that the infectivity of a virus depends on properties of the population of viruses by which you're infected. And actually the variations across the population are what defeat the immune system in a very complex set of interactions which has a huge evolutionary history. And so actually, I mean, and I guess this made me understand something that's kind of been a little puzzling. If you have the sort of simple view of the virus, as you know, one particle gets into your cell and then releases all these other virions, you think one virus would be enough to get you sick, one virion. Now sometimes, in some cases that's true. In others, as we, I think, learnt in COVID, actually it's very important how large a dose you get. And that's actually to do with probably the diversity within the population of viruses that infects you. So actually the process of viruses interacting with hosts can often be a population level phenomenon rather than an individual level phenomenon. Again, something that's a much more natural thought in terms of this flow picture, I think, than in terms of a thing with nasty properties. And I guess a final thing that I think is, is now becoming increasingly clear, and again I think is within this broader picture should be totally unsurprising, is that viruses mostly, of course, are harmless, but actually many of them are probably functional and essential, and in fact maybe the outnumbering the cells in your body are the viruses that you require for the stability of your system. In particular, one obvious way in this they do this is by regulating the bacterial populations. Most of the viruses in your body are phages, that's to say viruses that the hosts of which are bacteria, and the numbers of phages in your body makes it seem very likely that they have important roles in stabilizing the relations between the different sorts of organisms in your body. I just lost the, there we go. Okay, so some conclusions. I think I argue that our thinking about life is actually hampered by its grounding in the worldview that since the scientific revolution has driven a great deal of scientific thought. Basically a picture of things pulling one another, stuck together to form mechanisms, machine-like connections of these entities. So life isn't, like this sort of put all the bits together and the machine starts to go. It's this really hard-won, constantly maintained moment of structure and stability that emerges somehow, and of course it doesn't emerge, the moment you're born, it's emerged over billions of years of evolution from this surrounding ocean of broadly directionless activity. And I think realizing this should give us a very different view of many aspects of life and even of ourselves. And that's what I will hope to convince any of you who come back for more in the course of this week, in the next and the rest of this series of lectures. But for now, I'll just end with, if you are interested in this, here's a place to go and find out more. And I'm happy to do this because this is an open access book. Anybody can read it, and so I'm not trying to make money off royalties or anything. It's a sad, sorry state for an academic to be in if I were. But this is where to look for more on many of these topics. Okay. Right, so I will take questions. I'm instructed to ask if you could make your questions as short as you can, because I've been asked to try and summarize them before answering them. And yeah, I saw you first, and then yeah. So.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. So I think I buy the picture when we're looking at biology. And then the question is, how would the dialectic with your non-process opponent go concerning other things? And one way to phrase that would be to say whether one could somehow ape some of what you get from process philosophy within a thing ontology, but with processes. So here would be the slogan on the T-shirt of that view. So it would be, organisms involve processes, but they are not processes, as it were. So they involve processes, but they're not. So you have the sort of thing view, there are various processes going on, and you say these processes are connected with the organism, which is their thing. And the difference between your view and that view seems to be that you identify the organism straightforwardly with the processes, whereas this view acknowledges that there are multiple processes, all these things that you don't talk about, it just resists the identification. We don't need to go into the reasons for why there's the resistance, but what would you say to this theorist?
Okay, so I have some sympathy with that question, and I guess the sympathy I have is that I can see why one might want to just introduce a new term, right? So I think there's that, the things I contrast it with, things, substances, really carry philosophical baggage that has really been unhelpful in thinking about life. So I want to suggest that the reason that what unites this unhelpful baggage is its kind of staticism, the fact that it doesn't adequately involve the fact that the properties we're interested in are outputs of all kinds of activity. Now, you might say, but now we've got, and I think this is earlier today, it's somewhat similar. You might say, well, okay, so organisms are very unlike traditional, or many of, don't share many of the properties that have traditionally been paradigmatic of things, substances in the philosophical tradition. But on the other hand, they're not terribly like what we used to think of as processes, i.e., your example actually was that I mentioned was the party, or I had the picture of a battle, or when or the erosion of a cliff, or there are sort of processes that seem as if they are necessarily happenings that happen to things. So maybe we should have the things, but then of course, if some of the things aren't at all like traditional things, maybe we don't want to say that. We don't want to say the organisms are things, but we don't want to say they're processes. So maybe we can call them something else. We can come up with a word for them. My personal feeling, well, I guess for two reasons. One is it's always a kind of uphill struggle, inventing a whole new category and saying that, we need to start thinking in terms of a kind of category of an ontological category that we didn't really know existed before. But the other thing is there is a tradition here. I mean, I may have sounded as if there was basically Heraclitus, Whitehead, and then me, and I certainly don't mean to say that. I mean, and for example, one of the things my collaborator on this book, Dan Nicholson, has done a great deal of work on is the early 20th century biology, which was inspired actually by Whitehead, people like Waddington, and various, actually, Wooja, who I mentioned at that point, was involved with it. So a bunch of biologists who have tried to articulate a process ontology. And I think there's a little historical story that actually, if you look at the 20th century, up to about, let's say, 1953, you have a lot of theoretical biology that's process directed. And then 1953, as everybody probably knows, with the structure of DNA was published. And this initiated an extraordinarily productive, but in some way misguided, his chapter in the history of biology. We found out a huge amount, but that also embedded a lot of really misleading views, notably the view that biology was basically just all, run by these little bits of DNA, which we now know is completely wrong. They're wonderful molecules, DNA, but it's not a blueprint and it's not a master molecule. It's just part of a complex system. And I think so I don't think we need to go outside the tradition and invent something new. I think we need to, reclaim a lot of the pre-DNA biology, and it's easy to do that in a way because we know actually lots of things about DNA that make us see it's a thoroughly active molecule that's constantly doing things, changing its shape, changing its chemical structure. It's as dynamic as, there are aspects of it that are importantly very stable, but even them, they're not stable because it's a very stable molecule. They're stable also because there's a whole host of systems that stabilize it, that repair the sequence when it gets damaged, and so on. So I think that picking up this thread and saying, actually, no, these process-oriented biologists prior to, I say, the second half of the 20th century were so right about the basic metaphysics, even if, a quite different view has been very productive, we should pick it up and reassert the processual nature of life. Right? I've got lots of questions, but
Great, thanks for a great talk. I think this is all right. If anything, I'd be happy with it going into further in some ways. So this is a relatively small thing, but basically I was wondering why you think that cancer being multi-causal means that there couldn't be a process. So let me illustrate what I mean. I use this distinction that I think can be quite helpful in philosophy of medicine. So it's something that I call sort of contributing causal factors and then realizing causal factors. So namely, you may have lots of different, not things, but lots of different causes contributing to the occurrence of some sort of phenomenon or whatever. But then it could have, and this is maybe where this talk might be useful in some ways, you could have a process that kind of instantiates the thing, if you like, so namely realizes it in the system. And so, one of the most promising paradigms for something like cancer is this framework that I mentioned earlier briefly, so basal cognition, and in that kind of framework, you may well have various, a whole range of reasons for this bioelectric communication to break down, right? Mm-hmm. But the ultimate sort of realizing thing that you could target would be communication breaking down, right? And so in that case, as long as you manage to kind of re-establish it, you would be getting rid of cancer, right? So, basically, I definitely think that cancer being multi-causal in the sense of contributing causal factors means that prevention would have to be multi-causal in that sense, right? Like you couldn't just decide on one course of action and prevent cancer. But treatment seems to be rather different because I think in most cases it targets something closer to realizing causal factors. So yeah, I was wondering what
well, I think it probably depends how broadly you interpret communication breaking down. And if you interpret it sufficiently broadly, I mean, this is always the case with sort of pluralistic arguments. I mean, you can make the terminology sufficiently inclusive to include all the things that a pluralist would like to break down. But it seems to me that taking, as I hear your question, that there is one particular kind of relation that the failure of which is what we call cancer. I mean, so that's the monistic reading of that. And if I took it that way, I would say that seems really improbable for the reason that I tried to give, that the articulation of all these cellular divisions, differentiations, and deaths that constitutes a healthy life cycle is not constituted by one single kind of relation. It's, I'm pretty sure, constituted by and maintained by an awful lot of relations. Now, if you say, those relations are communications between cells, yeah, perhaps that's right. I mean, messaging between cells determines whether they do these things. But that seems to me more almost like just describing cancer rather than providing an etiology for it. And that's why I say, in a sense, you've avoided the pluralism by taking a sufficiently wide-ranging definition of what's happening that you can just say, it's this not working anymore. I did see a lot of hands before, so we may have a chance, I'm sure, to...
Etiology is relevant for prevention, not necessarily treatment.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's, yeah.
So I was wondering that there can be an in-between case, which is neither just things or just processes, but if the stability which you think can be achieved is achieved in a time scale which is important for humans, then I think one might think that in that case we can use substance. But when the stability is not achieved we can just randomly actually probably say which is the time scale, then there is only processes. So there is one option which is not everything is thing, but very few things is thing, and more things are processed than we thought before. And that would be closer to your view, but a bit because the stability for you is very important. And if we would say that when the stability is stably achieved, then at least we can call it thing, then the kind of contrast between process and something else still can be maintained, which might be useful.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's something actually I'm very happy to do in many cases. I mean, I think, again, for those of you who were here earlier, I mean, that's how I would explain why mechanism is often a successful strategy, because the things that you identify as the parts of the mechanism are stable over the time scale you're interested in understanding. So and of course that might be a very short one, and there might be in everyday life, you might say, a certain degree of stability is sufficient to count as a thing. And of course that wouldn't in any way, I think, fundamentally contradict anything I'm saying. I'm happy with that. Clear.
What kind of mathematics would you suggest for process-based modeling in biology? This is a classical question because, say, in organicist tradition, in theoretical biology. So that question has been discussed since maybe Woodger, Bertalanffy, Waddington, René Thom, Robert Rosen. So what would be your answer?
My answer would be to, I'm afraid, to refuse to try and answer. I mean, you know, I'm not a mathematician, and you know, so I'm not going to adjudicate between somebody I can't understand at all like Rosen and somebody I can't understand very much like Bertalanffy. I think I have greatest respect for this kind of work, but it's not my pathway into the subject. I'm afraid to say. So yeah, I saw you say, yeah, yeah. And then yeah, you, and then.
Okay, so what can you tell us about the similarities or differences between your approach and autopoiesis and the extended cognition practices?
That's a good question. So, extended cognition, I think, is relative. I mean, I think it's very congenial, but I think it's in a different era. I mean, it's debate a different arena. I mean, it's arguing with different people. I say I'm very, very sympathetic to it, and I think I buy a lot of it. But I don't think it's kind of a competitor. I think it's just an ally. Though obviously I don't mean that all people in that line of work would necessarily agree. Autopoiesis. I have a lot of similarities, I think. The only trouble with autopoiesis is, well, the biggest trouble with it is the word autopoiesis. I mean, the notion that organisms make themselves, I find very unfortunate. And I think, you know, an awful lot of what, you know, Varela and Maturana actually say seems just right, and I'm totally sympathetic to. But the framework of, you know, things allegedly making themselves seems to me a pity. But that's probably just a little bit of a semantic quibble. I think there's a great deal in common, and I think I would mostly say, I guess, again, rather like Whitehead, they're not always the easiest people to understand. And I mean, you know, this sounds like laziness on my part, and probably is, but I do think that, you know, you know, I mean, Whitehead, I think, in all honesty, has done quite a lot of harm to process thinking. And not by getting things wrong so much as by making people think, oh my God, if I get interested in process, I'll have to read Process and Reality. And that's, you know, nobody wants to do that. I mean, I obviously exaggerate, but I do think, so obviously one of the aims of this project is to try and suggest actually I mean, and obviously I leave others to judge whether I'm succeeding in this, but really one ought to be able to say this sort of stuff in a perfectly straightforward, understandable way. It's really easy to understand. And I think, you know, I think, you know, Varela and Maturana sort of often make it seem harder than it is, and come up with, and I guess the production of weird and slightly misguided terminology is part of that. So I would say definitely an ally, definitely right about lots, but also slightly a little bit of the Whitehead thing of making people think it's much harder to understand and probably not worth the trouble. So that's I'm not very happy with that answer, but it'll maybe do for now. Yeah. Okay.
So, as I understand, the merit of this process-based metaphysics, process metaphysics, is that it solves a family of problems kind of related to the shape of thesis, like in biology. Like, where are the boundaries? Is it the same organism after the dragonfly first stage larva and then the pupa stage and so on? Okay, but I remember from my studies of like cell biology and molecular biology that the nitty-gritty of these subjects are studied quite mechanistically. We were interested in like different gates and triggers and like the movement of the molecules themselves. So it seems that this process metaphysics is helpful for framing, like when you talked about cancer and viruses, I completely agree. But the nitty-gritty of it seems to me that the mechanistic view has been very fruitful.
Yeah.
So do you think that these two can be somehow like can coexist?
Absolutely. And this comes back to, I just alluded to in the question a moment ago, that I don't think, it's not that I want to say all this mechanistic explanation is completely misguided at all. I think we've discovered, and this is why I say, that the very mechanistic biology that followed the kind of analysis of DNA and the processes of translation and all of, I mean, that's wonderful biology, looks kind of mechanistic, and the last thing I want to do is to say that's all rubbish, right? So absolutely. But there's two levels. The first is there's two kinds of reply. The first is, yes, I think it's perfectly intelligible within a process framework, simply by just recognizing that when you're talking about a mechanism, you're not talking about, fixed parts. You're talking about parts that are sufficiently fixed for the time frame that you're interested in. But there are other perspectives in which these parts are changing. These parts maybe, are doing other things. There are other perspectives that you might, if you think too much in terms of biology as being about finding mechanisms, there are things that you're not going to notice or you're not going to focus on. I'm sorry again to people who've been here in this morning, but I will repeat one kind of line of examples here. I'm fascinated by the parallel histories in some ways of genomics and proteomics, that that they start out with, so here's the genome, here are all these genes lined up. What do they do? Here's the gene for this, here's the gene for that, and maybe the gene for is just the gene for making a particular protein. It doesn't have to be the gene for aggression or something really silly. But at any rate, we've got all this stuff. Similarly with, protein studies. We used to have the protein that catalyzes this particular reaction, the protein that makes muscle fibers. We look at this thing, we identify them, see what kind of mechanism we can fit them into. And then we gradually find that this is hugely simplistic, that this stretch of DNA not only isn't the gene for aggression or homosexuality or some nonsense that sociobiologists might have come up with, it's actually not even the gene for making a particular protein, that it's really just a resource that can be used to make often many different proteins. Then, I mean, and then of course, we also find epigenetics and so on that makes all of this even more complicated. Same thing with proteins. It's a slightly more, it's a slightly more complicated, actually I think a deeper problem, that people would think, what's the function of this protein? That's a bad question, because what we find is, of course, there is a system which we can call a mechanism in which this protein does something and helps us to understand. But then we find, and as I again, sorry to repeat myself, but one of my favorite bits of giveaway language in biology is we found these things were moonlighting, right? We have moonlighting proteins that were doing something other than their job in their spare time. And, and then they find they do 10 different jobs. And what you realize is that the notion that you have this set of parts that fit into a mechanism in some way obscures something really fundamental about how biological systems work, that they make multiple use of the parts. and the parts actually become different parts in different uses. So having first of all moved on to the moonlighting proteins, we now find at least half of them are the IDPs. I never remember what it stands for. That's right. The intrinsically disordered proteins, which actually exist in a whole bunch of different structures and only settle on a structure in a particular context. So, I mean, the diversity of these resources, the fact that the system, and this is, I think, is a kind of downward causation, is able to use these resources in multiple different ways, in different contexts, is, I think, an absolutely fundamental thing about how life, A, is possible, and B, is very unlike anything or at least any traditional way of thinking about mechanism. And it's not so we can look at the particular mechanisms, and if we start with a particular phenomenon, how does a particular a molecule get synthesized, we can look at a mechanism. But if we then start thinking, okay, so now we've located the function of all the elements involved in that mechanism, then we've shut off all kinds of thoughts that we might have about what these things can do. So again, it's not that there's anything wrong with all the mechanistic understanding we have. It's just that it can provide a framework which discourages us from looking at certain things and pushes certain directions over others. I mean, there's an awful lot to find out in biology, and mechanistic thinking has enabled us to find out an awful lot of stuff. But it also, I think, comes at a cost in terms of kind of channeling thought in some directions and tending to channel it away from other directions. Sorry, you
I have a somewhat morbid question about the boundaries of an organism.
the boundaries of
Organism.
okay.
And do you think death may be a way to draw these boundaries? So, for example, if a human dies instantly, presumably the bacteria on the skin do not die at the same instant.
Right.
And you could say that there's a boundary right here. So everything that died together instantly is within the boundary, the bacteria outside.
Well, but why would you say that? I mean, so I guess two reasons I would be skeptical of that. One is, I mean, death is, ending is, I think, is easier than beginning. So you've, but supposing that you, putting that on one side, why would you, I mean, so if you have, absolutely required bacterial symbionts, they don't necessarily die with they might carry on with, the next thing that ate you after you died. Or they might, typically, I guess, they mostly die, but by no means always or necessarily. So I'm not sure why you would want that to be a criterion.
Then you can distinguish between living organisms. You can have, there's a boundary for living organisms in that scenario.
I take it the idea would be you decide of the living organism whether something is part of it on the basis of whether it dies when that organism dies. Is that the thought? So yeah, I mean, certainly it's an interesting suggestion, but I'm not sure I can quite see the motivation for it, apart from it being a criterion that you could apply and that would give you some answers sometimes. But even then, does it? I mean, I guess I don't actually know the sort of empirical facts about what the probability of a random part of your skin bacteria. I guess they've probably got a good chance of living, and they tend to be quite transitory. So let's say your gut bacteria. I don't know what proportion of them die when you die. I mean, I think a lot of what happens is the proportions of different kinds change dramatically. And some kinds find themselves very happy living on your corpse, and become others are not so happy and become less. So So maybe, and maybe you want to say, I don't, if you're going to eat my corpse, you're not part of me. But more seriously, I don't really see a motivation for it. I mean, is there, apart from, I mean, again, depending sort of on the empirical facts, it could turn out that there was a really nice cutoff and certain obligate symbionts did pretty much all go when you went. But I'm not sure if that's true. And it wouldn't be very surprising if it were not true, right? I mean, if lots of obligate symbionts tended to carry on just fine, eating you for a bit and waiting till somebody else ate you, I mean.
Well, I think that having distinct boundaries is a characteristic of things.
Sorry?
Having clear boundaries is a characteristic of things. And you would say that being able to delineate the clear boundaries from an organism suggests that an organism is distinct.
Yeah, I mean, but I guess I suppose it's I know that's what I think you say. I mean, temporal boundaries, yes. I mean, you know, lots of stuff dies, but why that should be an answer to the question of spatial boundaries when you're not dead, I guess is the question that I don't really see a strong motivation for. But it's a yeah.
Briefly carry on with the morbid subtopic. I was just wondering, do you regard death as a process or an end of process, or where does that fit in?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, I guess something I don't talk about much at all are events, which are in many philosophers' ontologies very important. I tend to think events are just very short, sharp processes, but I guess, you know, one differentiation that a lot of people would make would say death is an event. Of course, but then I guess I would also say not necessary. A slow, lingering death, if we're going to be morbid, is much more like a process. You know, a bullet in the head, pretty much an event. But sorry to get.
To add that on this point, legally, it's still very difficult to say when someone is technically dead, because what is death is complicated. Is that the cardiac arrest, we can pinpoint the moment of the cardiac arrest, is that the moment when the brain is too damaged to be started again, we start the heart again. So even having a pinpoint on that is really, really difficult in medicine, and especially in the question of organ transplant. The moment where we can harvest, I would say, organ of someone because this person is dead is still a tricky part.
Isn't the absence of brainstem reflexes?
It depends. In fact, it depends
Yeah, exactly. But then that's when you go to harvest the organ.
Yeah, it depends on the legislation of the country. In France, you have to be branded with certain measure for at least 20 hours. And I think that in the UK, the part understood. It really depends. In fact, it's a legal definition more than legal help by science, but it's more a legal definition than science.
Yeah, and it's probably driven. Yeah, it is driven more by pragmatics and operationalizability, I think, rather than any deep kind of philosophical insight. I mean, obviously, people would sometimes like there to be a deep philosophical truth, but I think for just the sort of reasons you're saying, it's kind of hard to locate one. And certainly, yeah, you could be brain dead, and your symbionts would live happily for years while you were in a permanent vegetative state, which some people might say was a state post-death. So yeah, that's actually. Yeah. Okay, one last question. Is anybody who hasn't asked a question? Okay, so.
So you describe yourself as a promiscuous individualist.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to just bracket that a little bit. I asserted a philosophical position that I call promiscuous.
Yes. So I'm just wondering about the non-promiscuous process theories here, because the promiscuity here concerns a kind of way of different ways of abstracting organisms from this flux. So in principle, there could be a position which was much like yours in terms of the underlying ontology to some degree, except that they were more of a Quinian, or more sort of a hardliner about processes of individuation and abstraction. What would the consequences be? Because it seems that at some ontological level there is some agreement about the underlying flux, but then you're abstracting individuals in this promiscuous way, which you're a realist about, but they want to be deflationary about the abstraction process, as it were.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to say about that. I mean, I'll say one thing which may be a bit tangential. I mean, I think sometimes people get into some of the more bizarre views in philosophy by feeling the need to assert, firm boundaries. And one example I think of is, some kind of analytic metaphysicians that I, in many ways, would respect, who argue that the human life begins when twinning is no longer possible. Now, I mean, basically because if twinning is possible, then they're led into the contradiction that you might become two non-identical people, and that would mean a contradiction. So life has to begin at the moment, whenever that may be, when it is no longer possible in theory to. I mean, that strikes me as a kind of reductio ad absurdum of metaphysical argument of the most extreme kind. I mean, that that's their problem, not the problem for the perfectly happy non-twinning embryo that is part of the same process as the non-twinned fetus that it becomes. It's just, whereas again, I say, if you're happily kind of promiscuous processualist, we'll say no, it's a process that's divided. I mean, that's this is. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question. It probably doesn't. I'm pretty sure it does.
That's what helps, because you're sort of saying that this kind of abstraction, in fact, empirically goes with the nature of the phenomena, which requires this underlying ontology, and so it's sort of like a package.
Yeah, and I think, as I say, I think if I were looking for a kind of reductio of the assumption that somehow one has to draw the boundaries around an individual, that would be a nice place to go, at least, because actually, it's just the process is split, and all the industry of split brains and all of that is just an industry of self-destruction for substance theorists in my world, for which I don't think I have any problems with at all. So.